My sheep hear my voice. I want to think about, first of all, just noting that the imagery that Jesus uses continually through the gospel, likening his flock or his followers to sheep, may not be necessarily a compliment. Anyone who has had any knowledge or working with sheep know that it's being charitable to say they may not be the brightest creatures of all time. So we have to take Jesus' words with perhaps a grain of salt. One of my experiences of sheep was having a border collie mixture named Rupert. And Rupert had enough of a border collie in him to have all those characteristics of herding that were so wonderful. And Tim and I decided what he might enjoy is watching other border collies do sheep herding. And at one time, and it may still continue over in Millerton, there was a farm that would have sheep herding trials. And what would happen is there was a long expanse of a field that would go up a hill, and the spectators, of which there were a large number, would be in chairs that watching the extraordinary process of these dogs being called by their leaders, and therefore through a number of signals, verbal signals and whistles, they would know how to herd the sheep. And we would watch these amazing processions of sheep going out and the dogs herding them up the hill and then back down the hill and into the pen. Or at least most of the time, that's the way it worked. I remember one wonderful time when we were all seated in comfort in the shade on a very hot June day, and we watched one particular dog go out, and the sheep were up on the hill, and then they came racing down the hill. We watched them come closer and closer, and for some reason the dog lost control of them and didn't get them to turn, and the sheep headed right into the spectators. I think probably to the delight of the dogs. But I want to think about calling and speaking and listening and hearing, which is so much part of the readings that we have for this Sunday. You have, of course, in the first reading in the Acts of the Apostles, the calling of Peter to raise Tabitha from the dead. People go out and seek him and call him in to perform this part, this miraculous part of his ministry as a disciple. And then you have the beautiful passage from Revelation, which is the calling forth of the saints of God, the calling out of the saints in a great chorus of praise in this beautiful vision of heaven. And finally, of course, the story in the gospel where Jesus talks about us being like sheep. And like sheep, we are called by the shepherd. And we recognize the shepherd's voice, we trust that voice, and the shepherd calls us each by name in gathering us together. And in that idea of calling, it's an English word that has any number of meanings. It has the meaning of verbally speaking or calling out to someone. It also has a meaning of, for example, a telephone call, calling someone to reach them and connect with them. It also is used in another sense as meaning vocation, the calling to a certain ministry or life of service. So in the church, we often refer to the calling to the priesthood that certain people have and then are ordained, or the vocation that all of us share as the baptized. That idea of vocation and life of service and ministry is certainly one thing that is in the story from the gospel. But I want to start with the meaning of calling that's fallen out of currency in our modern day, and that is the social custom of calling. Now, I was introduced to this idea where people would call on one another and present little calling cards that you would either give to the person in the house, or if there was a servant, it'd be presented to them. There was an elaborate ritual of what corner you turned down, had different meanings. Now, the reason I know this, you may ask, and be very well-founded in asking this, is that it's particularly appropriate on Mother's Day that I recall how strange a child I must have been to my mother and father. Because at an early age, I was mesmerized and devoured books of etiquette from the 1920s. I wish I were making this up. I seemed fascinated, and probably it was my grandparents who came from a different era, but I just found it so interesting, all of the nuances of what went into a well-mannered life. And I do remember my favorite thing from one of the volumes that I consumed was advice about giving a garden party. And the author said, when giving a garden party, very often the most important aspect of that is overlooked by the host. And that is, never forget to make sure that there's a footman at the gate to the estate to keep back the curious. So every time Tim and I do any kind of entertaining, I always say to him, has the footman been dispatched to the gate? We don't want any curious to break into this party. A really different era. But when I got to Church of the Messiah, there was still stories told about the grand era in Rhinebeck, when the great families along the Hudson River had beautiful homes, and certainly the etiquette and the custom of calling was very much part of life there. And my predecessor at Messiah, Jerry Gallagher, and his wife Joy, learned this firsthand. They came to Messiah in the mid-1980s, and Jerry was newly ordained, but he had only served ministry in prison ministry. He had never been in a parish, and he had certainly never been in a parish like Rhinebeck. And so Joy had 4 very young children. Jerry was off, as they told the story, doing parish things. Joy was home alone, trying to unpack, having just moved in. And the doorbell went, and she opened the door, and there was Daisy Sukley. Now, Daisy Sukley was someone I would have given anything to have met. She was a very close friend of FDR, and she was a pillar of that parish, and very eccentric and wonderful. She lived in her beautiful house that has now been restored, Wilderstein, on the Hudson. And there were great stories told about her in the parish. My favorite that really showed what she was made of was that the vestry at Messiah in the 1970s decided to be very current in liturgical practice, and they decided to move the marble altar out from the wall so that the priest could get behind the altar and face the people. Now, Daisy Sukley's family had given that altar in memory of one of their sons that had died in World War I. And the vestry made this decision, and the next day the rector, so the story goes, went in to open up the church, and there he saw Daisy Sukley with a chair and a thermos of tea and a good book sitting in front of the altar. And he said, "Miss Sukley, are you all right?" And she said, "No, I'm not." And he said, "Well, what can I do?" And she said, "Well, that's a very good question because it's precisely you I want to talk to. I understand that the vestry has made the decision to move my family's altar from its proper place against the wall forward." And so he said yes, and he then, in great detail, explained all the reasons why this was to be desired. And she said, "No, I don't care about that. I'm not leaving here until you promise me you won't touch this altar." And he said, no, I'm sorry. That boat has sailed. We've made the decision. I'm very sorry. And he left. Around 5 o'clock, he went back, and there was Daisy still sipping her tea and reading her book. And he called the vestry and said, we're not moving the altar. And to this day, it still is against the wall. But anyway, on this particular morning when Joy had just moved in and was trying to manage 4 young children, the doorbell goes, and there's Daisy Sukley and her cousin in hat, gloves, standing, making their social call to the new rector. And Joy, I think it's safe to say, had never had anyone call on her in that way. And she looked very quizzical at them, and Daisy said, oh, my dear, we're making a social call. And she said, okay. And Daisy said, it's customary to come in and visit. And so Joy remembered herself and invited them in. And as she came in, Daisy took her by the arm and gently tapped her and said, don't worry, dear, we believe in a strict 10-minute visit. And Joy loved saying that without ever looking at any timepiece, exactly on 10 minutes, she stood up with her cousin and left, having paid her social call. That's one meaning of calling, one way of thinking about how we are called. And I will say etiquette does change over time. I was dismayed to read recently in the Times that there have been major changes in what's considered proper and etiquette and polite in the new age of technology. And apparently, if you're under 70 years of age, it is considered somewhat rude to just call someone on the cell phone. You're supposed to text first and make sure they're expecting your call so you don't interrupt them. And when I read that, I said to Tim, I'm out. This is becoming way too complicated. But in thinking about the meaning of calling and being called in terms of the gospel and in terms of the church's understanding of that, in the idea of being called to a life of service and ministry, is not confined to those who are ordained, but as I say, it's common to us all. We are all called by Christ, by name. And in that, we are reminded of that in the gospel reading, that we are called as sheep are called by the shepherd. Now, there's a very famous painting by William Holman Hunt called Light of the World. It's a pre-Raphaelite, late Victorian painting that you probably have all, if you don't recall, have seen other reproductions of it, with Jesus with a lantern knocking at a front door of a home. And in that image has been very powerful, and it's often interpreted as being based in scripture readings which talk a lot about knocking at the door. In the Christian Testament, again and again, there are references in the stories that Jesus tells, in the parables about neighbors, bridegrooms, who come knocking at the door, seeking something. And the interpretation of the church is what they seek are the inhabitants of the house, that they are to let Jesus into the house and, by metaphor, into their lives by opening the door. For a deeper relationship, probably someone's going to get a phone call or a text. It's not me texting you, so I'm all safe. The idea that we would invite Jesus in, hearing the call, the knock on the door, and that we would be invited into a deeper personal spiritual relationship with Christ. Now, like all of you, I've been astounded at, first of all, the speed in which the church has moved in electing a new pope. We moved from the death of Francis to the election of Leo, it seemed to me, extraordinarily quickly. And one of the things that happened in that time were the stories that were told about Francis that had not necessarily been published or told while he was alive. He clearly was a man who lived and believed in a very simple way of living, even as Pope. But one of the stories that I loved is that apparently at the conclave where he was elected Pope, there's a tradition that I guess the people who have the best chance of the front runners, I've never been, are given the opportunity to deliver a short meditation or homily to the gathered cardinals. And when Francis got up, he delivered a meditation about the image of Hunt's painting, The Light of the World. And what he said was, most people look at this painting and think it's about Jesus being invited into our lives. But I'd like to think about it being Jesus inviting us out of our houses and into the world. And I love that way of looking at it. It takes from being just simply a private, devotional, spiritual relationship with Christ into a broader understanding of what it means to be a Christian. For me, it's not just admitting Jesus into our lives and our world, but a reminder that there is a world all around us in which we are not only asked and called, but required to participate in. It's a world that needs word about God's love, about God's redeeming grace, unconditional love, the promise to try to be the hands that heal the brokenness of our world. For me, it's a reminder that Christianity is indeed a profound and deep devotional life of faith. But it's also a life that's committed to activism and action. It's a call to be present in the world, to be the healing power of God. And yes, of course, we come to that by Jesus entering into our lives. But as Francis reminded the cardinals, and we think about today, it doesn't end there. It's an invitation to step out into the world, fed by our communities, fed by our families, fed by those we love. We are then sent forth, just the way the disciples were sent forth, to raise people's lives out of brokenness and death into life. And we're called to do it again and again. And if you have any question about it, just read the baptismal liturgy about new life and the promise of new life that is not a private moment, but a moment of being called out to ministry. So, I like to think about the idea of calling and a call to life and a life of service. But my hope and prayer would be that we would always hear the voice of Jesus calling us, knocking on the door of our life, to call, to serve, and to love. Amen.